Now I'll show you my video game systems from the second half of the 90s. By 1995, there had been many game systems that had come and gone, but three main ones had stayed in: the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo, and the Neo Geo AES, for those who liked those arcade games. They kept making games for these systems, but when the Sega Saturn came out, that's when people started jumping to the new platforms. Sega Saturn was great for arcade-style games like the Neo Geo was. Had lots of fighters, and the control pad was perfect for them. Had good diagonals. Had 6 buttons on the face of the controller. There was a good variety of games for it, just not nearly the quantity that PlayStation has. The Saturn even has RPGs, although very few in the United States. And it does have a couple Sonic games, but really they're just remakes of the old Sonic games for Genesis with better graphics or added features, and a racing game. PlayStation became the most popular system out of the new generation. It had many RPGs for it. Its controller layout was similar to Super Nintendo, except it had nice comfortable handles and had more shoulder buttons. So when it came to comparing fighting games, the Saturn was really more comfortable for fighting games. The PlayStation just had so many more kinds of games and amounts of games that it pretty much beat the Saturn easily. Now, Nintendo decided before moving on to their next console, they'd give a shot at improving their handheld. Well, the Virtual Boy wasn't really handheld. It was portable, but not portable enough. Plus the fact that its graphics were all red and black drove many people away from it. But it did have a couple good games, and probably the best one for the Virtual Boy is Wario Land. Wario Land is just as good as any other Mario platformer. Other than that, there are only a couple other good games. Sega decided to try and improve their handheld at the same time. What happened was they decided, hey, we have a lot of Genesis games already out. Why don't we turn it into a handheld and let people use the same games, so we already have an installed user base in our handheld market. That was a very good concept, but this thing sucked the life out of batteries, and was also quite bulky. Genesis games are pretty big to be carrying around a ton of games. Now the Game Boy Pocket was perfect. They made the original Game Boy screen better. Took the same exact games, took smaller batteries, and was so small it would easily fit in someone's pocket. Then came the Nintendo 64. This brought back analog sticks. It also added memory cards to the back of the controller instead of the front of the system. Most games actually saved to the cartridge itself, though, as this system used cartridges instead of CEs like the PlayStation and Saturn. It also was successful due to its popular game series. Got Mario, Zelda, many others. didn't really have many RPGs besides Zelda. But it also had fighters and puzzles and sports and all kinds of things that the other systems had. But also this system wasn't great for fighters either. Just the odd controller. The analog stick on this inspired Sony and Sega to add analog sticks to their systems. The Saturn controller is much like the Dreamcast controller. The PlayStation actually added 2 analog sticks in addition to the control pad. They actually serve as different functions in most games. Games from 1997 and on use these functions a lot. Now, in 1997, Tiger tried to enter the handheld market again. They tried doing an R-Zone, which is similar to Virtual Boy, but it wasn't very good. It was probably worse than Virtual Boy. Now, the GameCom is a lot like the Nintendo DS concept of touchscreen. Came with a little pen, you could touch the screen. This thing was black and white though, and the games for it were usually ports of popular games like Arcade Classic Williams and Sonic Jam. But the games usually lagged on the system. You'd start running and then the screen would go slow. It just didn't work very well. Nintendo decided to improve their Game Boy finally beyond just size and revisited the idea of adding color to the handheld games. They thought maybe, well, the problem it sucked the battery life so much is a backlit screen. The Game Gear, the Lynx, the Nomad, they all tried color, but they decided to make the Game Boy Color backward compatible with Game Boy games and not use a backlight so the battery life would still be good. And they brought out new games with Nintendo characters. So it was pretty successful. After the Game Boy Color, the Sega Dreamcast came out the next year. Now, this was Sega's new hardware, new console. They decided to stop the Saturn because it wasn't doing very well against the PlayStation. So this had much better graphics, all kinds of games, great variety, even actually some more RPGs this time. And they used the idea of Nintendo's memory cards in the controller. This was probably one of the best systems. This is the most technologically great system by this time. Neo Geo Pocket was the last system in the late 90s. It was a color handheld system just like Game Boy Color, except it had lots of ports of Neo Geo classic arcade games like Metal Slug and their fighting series like King of Fighters. It even had a port of a Sonic game. It's much like Sonic 2 with slightly different things in it. Well, this is it for the late 90s game systems. There weren't as many as in the early 90s, so choosing the consoles in this generation pretty much had to do with what kinds of games you were looking for. Choosing the handhelds was quite a bit easier, as Nintendo's Game Boy line was still the strongest to go with, while the other things didn't really do too well or didn't have as many games for them.